Gabriel Kahane, I'm glad we could have a chance to talk about your music. But before we do that, I want to talk about something that you've posted about and you've mentioned in interviews, which is a lack of nuanced thinking in the world today. And I'm wondering, what role do you think music can play in adding nuance to our world?
Oh boy. uh, well, there's so many ways to answer that question. I guess I would say I think there are all kinds of ways that artists can approach being of value in the world. Um, but I think that at a time when we are rather polarized, um, I'm increasingly finding, as someone with a lot of political convictions, that trying to open people's hearts feels more politically useful than trying to convince people of something. Um, in part because many of us are sort of ideologically calcified, and increasingly our ideological silos are smaller and smaller and smaller, and the extent to which we're willing to deal with, acknowledge difference even within our tribes seems to be waning. And I think when you go back and you look at sort of the history of coalition building, say in the civil rights um, era of the 1960s, not that it's very easy to go back and look with rose-colored glasses, and there was plenty of rancor in the 60s, but I think there was also a kind of pervasive ethic of love, and that enabled coalition building across race, class, gender, not so much sexuality in the 1960s, but I think that one of the ways that we can achieve nuance is through spending time with each other one-on-one, rather than trying to communicate to a lot of people at once. I mean, I think one of the things that I've thought about quite a lot in the aftermath of spending a year offline is the difference between doing what we're doing, which is using technology to communicate one person to one person, versus the sort of incentives built by algorithms and technology companies, wherein we're rewarded for kind of lowest common denominator speech that appeals to what they call activating emotions. Um, but I mean, it's a difficult question um, to answer, and I suppose the sort of most distilled response that I can offer is to say that I think activating empathy in ourselves makes us better equipped to deal with opinions and experiences that are different than our own. And if we can do that, then we can sort of create a space in which dialectical thinking can flourish, because we're not terrified that we're going to have our heads lopped off for, say, acknowledging the veracity of some aspect of an opposing opinion.
Right. Well, it's also, we live in a world where it just gets easy to identify people by one thing, or the
Yeah.
attempt to identify people by one thing. And I know that one of the things that sort of shudder against is when people try to classify the work that you do by genre, where there's this concern about what genre is it. And you did an interview with Zoe Madonna for Van Magazine in 2016, and you said the more interesting question to ask is, does the embrace of hybrid music by these institutions have to do with the decline of the audience for concert music? Or is it an embrace that comes from thinking that hopefully this is where the deepest music is coming from? Do you have an answer to your own question 6 years later?
Um, I guess yes and no. I think what I actually think is the more interesting question, and the reason that I tend to bristle at questions about genre, is that we often are preoccupied with trying to classify rather than dealing with craft. And I think that I don't mind people using genre as a reference point if it's sort of on the way to a discussion of the craft of the work itself. I think the only thing that I object to, which happens a lot, is, and not just with my own work, but sort of trying to put things in containers at the expense of grappling with craft. As far as what, you know, what institutions are embracing and why, I think we're having a very different conversation now in a post 2020 landscape. I think that there's no one size fits all answer. I think every institution is different. And I think some of the institutions that I think are coming out on top in this moment are the ones that were sort of ahead of the curve in thinking about how to serve their communities and serve artists in a more diverse way before George Floyd was murdered, because their attempts to continue that work, and one example that comes to mind locally for you is CAP UCLA. I think Christy Edmonds, who of course has now gone off to run Mass MoCA, but she was presenting, I think, a very diverse slate of audiences throughout her tenure. So there wasn't a huge pivot. I mean, there was somewhat of a pivot. I think it's been, in the classical music world, where institutional racism and sexism have been pervasive for such a long time. I think there was a kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, where your efforts are either going to seem ham-fisted and too little too late, or like not enough. So that, the thing about hybridity also speaks to the sort of reassessment of how we think of or quantify greatness. And I think that, for me, I'm a straight white guy, and I was the beneficiary of institutions rethinking greatness outside of the context of identity, just on a sort of purely aesthetic basis. And I think one of the most welcome things to come out of whatever we want to call the sort of post-2020 awakening in arts institutions is just realizing what a narrow conception of greatness a lot of institutions and individuals have had. And I think I was a sort of beneficiary before that for different reasons. And I'm glad to see that there's a kind of expansion of what we think greatness is, and also whether greatness is even a useful term.
No, and I would argue that greatness is something defined by history, not by the moment that you live in.
Yeah, I think the sort of more interesting question is, like, are things resonating? Are they moving people? Are they, is a work of art causing a conversation, even if it's a conversation in which it's negative? So yes, I agree with that. I'm not sure if I answered your question. I think it's a tough time, obviously, post or whatever sort of moment of the pandemic we're in now. A lot of, whether it's orchestras or theaters or dance companies, are struggling to get audiences back. There are some places that are not. And I think we're also grappling with, in all of these institutions, how to have coherent programming that reflects the moment that we're in, that is supportive of a broad array of artists. And I think things are probably going to get worse before they get better. Because I think we're going to see institutions fold, more of them fold, before we enter whatever the next era is going to be. But I also feel a kind of optimism as younger voices and more diverse voices are in curatorial positions that the best may still be yet to come.
I hope you're right, and I hope that whatever that downturn is, whatever that negative dark period is short-lived.
I
Uh,
hope so too, for,
you know,
for the sake of my career.
well, I mean, if,
Else's.
of course, but if we look at the first quarter of next year, I mean, people are going to get exposed to a variety of things that you've done. I mean, obviously, San Francisco Symphony is giving the West Coast premiere of Emergency Shelter Intake. Laco is giving the West Coast premiere of.
Sorry, I just want to stop you just because I am here in Portland, Oregon. It's not the West Coast premiere. The West Coast premiere was in
Well,
Portland.
well, it's unfortunate. You should talk to San Francisco Symphony. I think that's how they have it listed. So the California premiere, we'll say.
Okay.
We'll say the California premiere, or it's my mistake. I don't know. But the lower West Coast premiere.
Fair enough.
But you've also got Heirloom at Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra. And then you're also going to be doing Magnificent Byrd at Phillips, which is sold out and people can see via live stream. But what would you like audiences to understand about who you are as a composer and who you are as a person from these three works that are all very different?
Yeah. Thank you for reminding me that I'm doing. There's a lot going on. As you mentioned, there's Emergency Shelter. There's Heirloom. There's also Cincinnati is doing The Right to Be Forgotten, which maybe you mentioned and I've already forgotten, as well as Magnificent Byrd in DC. Yeah, I think it's an exciting moment for me to be able to sort of look at what I've been doing over the last couple of years. I think what all of these works have in common, maybe Heirloom being the outlier, which is an intensely personal piece dealing with family history and my current family. They're all unified by an inquiry into the relationship between the individual and society, and the individual and another person, and how we conceive of other, and the relationship in both Magnificent Byrd and in The Right to Be Forgotten, the relationship between humans and technology. And for me, in making both Magnificent Byrd and The Right to Be Forgotten, which are kind of companion pieces, looking away from the internet and looking away from technology as a way to better understand it. And somewhere in that thread of looking at technology is also thinking about inequality and the extent to which big tech companies are able to scale up without a lot of brick and mortar investment. And that kind of hyper scalability is also something that contributes to inequality. And then sort of going back to 2018 and Emergency Shelter, on its surface, that's a work about homelessness, but really it's a piece about inequality, and homelessness is just a symptom of inequality. So it's, when you have these tech billionaires with one hand donating $100 million to study homelessness, and then on the other hand lobbying Congress to keep their taxes low, it's like that is sort of a net neutral proposition.
Well, I think it even goes beyond that. When you see all these billionaires in a race to see who can get space as an opportunity for tourism, it's like, I feel like all those billions of dollars that have been spent could have been spent in vastly superior ways, as opposed to putting phallic representations of themselves up into the atmosphere.
I have no idea who you're talking about.
It's all of them in that case, ultimately.
Yes.
Yeah,
I mean, I think I go back to the very first thing that I said in this conversation, which is just that more and more, I'm really, as hallmarky as it sounds, I'm really preoccupied with trying to get people to love each other better and to love themselves better. And I think often of that much bandied about Baldwin quote, which feels almost like it's turning into the Bernstein quote about we will make music more, blah, blah, blah. But there's this, great Baldwin quote where he says, white people will have enough work to do learning to love themselves and each other. And when they've done that, there will be no Negro problem, for there will be no reason for the Negro problem to exist. And what I love in that is just the extent to which he's articulating that fear is a product of self-hatred so much of the time. And so one of the things that I'm just really fixated on in my work is trying to get people to open themselves up to individuals, ideas, identities that are unfamiliar to them, or just, different in some sense, not necessarily alien, but just different. And in so doing, to activate a kind of empathy, and at the same time, sometimes to have people recognize themselves in a story and be able to be kind to themselves because of seeing themselves reflected in a story.
Right. Right. Well, and that inequality that you talk about, that's at the core of emergency shelter, which I've listened to, and I downloaded it and paid for it on Bandcamp, just so you know. Um, but it's like you used to live in Los Angeles. I mean,
I was born there, but I haven't
right,
lived in LA as an adult yet.
right. But it's gotten worse here.
Yeah.
You know, the inequality is far more pronounced, whether it's in people who are homeless, people who are ODing fentanyl, whatever's going on. And it seems like there's a genuine lack of political willpower, and certainly the NIMBY situation, not in my backyard, that you wrote about so beautifully in Emergency Shelter, that is colliding to leave us with no options. And I looked at something that the artist Barbara Kruger said that I thought was really interesting, which is, to me, these are the good old days, not because they're good, but because we are alive to experience and to change them.
Mm-hmm.
And what role do you see art in general, and perhaps your art specifically, in having to be able to change situations?
Well, I don't I don't know the answer to that, and I don't think it's necessarily direct. I mean, I'm sad to say, the Oregon Symphony commissioned Emergency Shelter. They commissioned the piece back in 2016, and I had a whole internal opera about whether or not to write the piece and whether I was the right person to do it. And ultimately, I said yes. Um, in no small part because I admired their courage in wading into a subject that kind of put a target on their back. They are downtown in the Arlene Schnitzer Concert Hall, where there are, tent communities up and down the block. I mean, not exactly outside, but pretty close. Um, and while there were some very beautiful things that came out of the premiere, including one woman who wrote to me and said that she had never realized the extent to which the mortgage interest deduction is a handout to rich people mostly. This is in the movement about Section 8 housing and sort of the way that we think conceptually in different ways about Section 8 housing vouchers, which, for those who are not familiar, are vouchers for low income folks to get subsidized housing. And yet they're only available to something like 1/5 of the people who apply for them. Whereas the mortgage interest deduction, if you own a home, you write it off. And this woman wrote to me and she said, I'm converting several of my rental properties into being only Section 8 housing because I feel like that's the least I can do. Now that's the sort of about as direct an impact as I could have hoped for. On the other hand, homelessness in Portland is worse now than it was 4 years ago when I wrote the piece. And I think that, I guess, the way in which I think of artists making a difference in a tangible way really has to do, or at least for me, has to do with the level of coalition building and the love and compassion and empathy that is required to do coalition building. I think one of the weaknesses of progressive politics right now is that we have forgotten that in the word coalition, it should be understood that we do not agree about everything. And that in order to build electoral coalitions that can change the social safety net, make it more robust, change the tax code, we're going to have to get into bed with people who we don't agree with about everything. And we have to have an expansive enough sense of our red lines and a big enough tent to make that possible. And where I think art can come into play is in giving people the sort of emotional and spiritual tools to get into the position where you can be in coalition like that. I don't think it's about giving, you know, Elon Musk an experience in the audience where suddenly he has an epiphany and realizes that he's a bastard and gives away all of his income. That's not going to happen. And that wouldn't really matter anyway, because the structural deficiencies are still in place. And part of the reason that we can't seem to make any progress on the housing crises that are, you know, mushrooming around the country, and not just around the country, in Europe as well, as European democracies weaken their social safety nets. You have to have a change to tax code. Also, I mean, look at what the Fed is doing with interest rates. Like, it's a neoliberal, fundamentally conservative way of handling inflation. I am not an economist, but there's plenty of great writing about, you know, ways to solve inflation that do not involve making working people suffer, which is what's happening right now.
Right, of course. Well, let's talk about a different kind of great writing, which is the writing you did for Alicia Hall Moran in Emergency Shelter. I happen to think she's immensely talented and would love to see her get more attention than she's been getting at this point. Did you write this with her in mind, or did she become the singer who could bring it to life for you?
Yeah, so I also adore Alicia, and thank you. So I actually wrote the piece for Misha Bruegger-Gossman, the Canadian mezzo, and for various reasons, Misha had to leave the project shortly after the premiere, and Alicia stepped in on 1 month's notice for the recording. And I should also mention that the album was her first ever performance of the piece.
Wow.
So she was really, you know, it was kind of trial by fire. Our first child had just been born, and I was introduced to Alicia, or made aware of Alicia, by the also great soprano Ariadne Greif. I don't know if you've had the pleasure of seeing or hearing her, but she said, "Oh, you should check out Alicia." And so Alicia trekked out to Brooklyn, where we were still living at the time. My daughter was 5 or 6 weeks old, and I basically taught her the piece sitting at the piano. And just, you know, fierce sense of pitch, sense of rhythm, sense of drama. Of course, you know, the following summer we did it in Chicago, and it was just, you know, it had grown all the more. But I've really loved getting to know her, and also getting to know her husband, Jason, who is a, you know, extraordinary pianist and composer, and really grateful that she kind of gets it at the level that she gets it. It's also interesting because, you know, she's a real activist, but also the daughter of one of the first, as she tells it, super successful Black men on Wall Street, and she sort of, you know, grew up with all the trappings of wealth, and yet that has not prevented her from really sort of, you know, digging into structural inequities in our society, whether they have to do with economics or racism. And she's just a great, really, you know, super thoughtful partner in music making. And yeah, I just feel very grateful to work with her.
And she will be with you in San Francisco, correct?
Yep. Yes.
So it'll be interesting to see how time has matured, what she brings to the work by the time you do have the performances in San Francisco.
Absolutely. Yeah, we will not have done it since summer of 2019.
Right.
Yeah.
3 years can make a big difference.
Yes. Yeah.
I love the idea that you had an opera in your mind, going on in your mind, about whether you should do this, because you seemed equally concerned about getting involved writing Heirloom, because you wrote on your Tumblr account, "I keep putting it off in large part because I've never felt comfortable with large-scale instrumental composition." Did writing Heirloom help you overcome that discomfort?
Um, First of all, I just want to footnote that it's really gratifying to do an interview where someone has really done their homework.
Thank you.
I, I can't tell you the number of times that I get on a phone call and I realize that like someone doesn't even know what instrument I play. So thanks for doing the deep dive. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think I still feel like a bit of an imposter when I'm writing instrumental music. Um, but one of the things that I was sort of specifically trying to tackle with Heirloom, that my friend Eric Jacobson, conductor of the Knights, founder and conductor of the Knights, and now the Virginia Symphony and Orlando Philharmonic, he had been nagging me for years to write something for my dad. And I had resisted and resisted. And then finally I said, yes, we put together this consortium of 6 orchestras, of which the LA Chamber Orchestra is one. And then just when it was about time for me to start sketching the piece, I was in Chicago to do emergency shelter there. And my dad was playing the Gershwin concerto on the first half. And there was a pre-concert talk. And the person conducting the pre-concert talk asked my dad, he said, what makes the Gershwin concerto so special? And my dad said, the miracle of the Gershwin concerto is that it sounds like Gershwin. By which he meant, as much as Gershwin was steeped in the music of his more formal contemporaries, and as much as he admired that music and felt himself to be an imposter and in the shadow of that music, he managed to write this concerto that we would all say sounds like Gershwin, sounds like Gershwin the songwriter. And I realized in that moment that that was what I wanted to do, was that I wanted to write a piano concerto that sounded not like Andrew Norman or Tom Addis or Missy Mazzoli, but like me. And so the sort of musical challenge was how to translate my language as a songwriter into a concert work without it sounding sort of retrograde or neoclassical. And then on the other hand, to sort of take these 3 inheritances, the musical inheritance from my parents to me, my father's inheritance from his mother who fled Germany, and then finally my older daughter's inheritance, which we don't know what that's going to be yet, except that she's as stubborn as I am. So I guess, yeah, in a sense, I would say that it did help me to get over some of that feeling of imposter syndrome, in as much as just treating melody as though it were a vocal line. When I'm writing vocal music, I feel very comfortable, writing for symphony orchestra or for quartet and voice. It's in the absence of text that I become unmoored. And I think that one of the things that helped me with writing Heirloom was to just think of those melodies as being vocal lines that just don't have text.
Did writing Heirloom change your relationship with these various inheritance that you're exploring in the 3 movements?
That's a great question. Not not particularly. I mean, I think that's in part because I think if composers are being honest, whenever we assign a program to abstract instrumental music, we're always doing a little bit of myth making. I think that in the case of this piece, the sort of non-musical subject matter really is there, but it's not like I was doing therapy as I'm sitting at at the desk. Like, now I understand my father. Um, um, I think that the slow movement, which is the movement for my grandmother, who has kind of surfaced in a number of pieces of mine. First piece that I wrote for the LA Phil back in 2011, called Orinoco Sketches, and then in the penultimate song from Book of Travelers, which is called Port of Hamburg, in which I set some of her diary from the time that she was leaving Germany and coming to the United States. I think that really sort of feels like the emotional center of the piece for me. And I was very close to her. She was an extraordinary person who went through a lot to, get where she was at the end of her life. And I feel like it's a nice musical testament to her life.
Right. Now, writing for your father, this is not the first time you've done that. He commissioned Django, Tiny Variations on a Big Dog from you. You guys also collaborated in 2013 on a mixtape concert as part of the Chamber Music Northwest Summer Festival. And now you've written this piano concerto. And I have to think that that creates a special relationship between you and your father that is probably unique amongst other pianist composers. And what do you think this journey, where do you think this journey has taken the two of you?
Oddly, because we share DNA, it's always been the case whenever he and I have worked together. He's conducted a few pieces of mine. There's actually less conversation or interaction than there would be with someone who's not a blood relative. I mean, I think one thing is just that among his gifts as a musician is the ability to sort of elevate and transcend what's on the page with anyone's music. I've always felt this with him, both as a pianist and as a conductor, that he's a sort of dream interpreter because his musicianship is just so kind of peerless that whatever you wrote, he's going to make it sound better than it was. On top of which, he and I are related. So he gets my music at a very, very deep core level because I am a part of him and he is a part of me. So really, the only conversations that we had were that, there were a couple spots where he said, I feel like this is sort of pianistically underwritten. Can you like thicken it up a little bit? And he also had some notes in the first draft about, places where he thought that the orchestration, him thinking as a conductor, he was like, the orchestration is too fussy. And I was like, no, Dad, it's fine. And then we got through the premiere and I was like, oh, he was right. and so I did one revision between Kansas City and Oregon. And now the last 10 days of the year, I'm planning one more revision so that hopefully LA audiences are getting what I hope will be the final draft, although it could change. There are still a few more orchestras to do it.
So we could say, once it happens, it could be the world premiere of the final version of Heirloom.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it will be the world premiere of the second revised version. I'm kind of a chronic tinkerer, and this is a piece where the first movement is kind of a beast. It's 15 minutes long, and the second and third movements feel like they work pretty well. And I'm just hoping to kind of understand better what the journey of that first movement is. I generally don't work in long form. I'm a songwriter, and so 15 minutes it feels a little bit like a run-on sentence right now, and I'm trying to clarify that.
All right. Well, because one of the things that I think you're so good at is a use of language, which I think this conversation has shown. But you did an interview when you became the creative chair of the Oregon Symphony, and the interview was with the Portland Monthly. And you talked about the existential muck of being human, which I love that. I love that. And I'm wondering how your work allows you to be more in touch or more accepting of that existential muck.
Well, I'm going to be honest. The thing that most puts me in touch now in this moment with the existential muck of being human is that in 8 minutes, I get to go be a dad to my two daughters who are 4 and 1. Our younger daughter just turned 1 a few days ago. And it's just really humbling being a parent. But and people say that, but I think the reasons that it feels so humbling are, one, that you're just trying to keep them alive and teach them to be kind, um, and that never ceases to amaze me. I think also being a parent just puts a lot of things in context. The right to be forgotten, which is a piece we didn't really touch on, deals sort of more deeply with the idea of professional jealousy and the relationship between the internet and professional jealousy than anything that I've done before. And it's something that I think most of us in the era of social media wrestle with, because social media is nothing if not an invitation to feel dissatisfied with our accomplishments. But I find that being with my daughters as they're discovering in their different phases of childhood how to be in the world and wondering at the world, and my 1-year-old looking out the window and seeing snow for the first time, it just reminds me how overly self-serious one can be, and how messed up our priorities and sense of hierarchical construction in the world are. So certainly music and songwriting, composing, songwriting, what have you, have helped me to make sense of the world. But in this particular moment, the thing that most makes me make sense of the world is being a parent.
Right. Well, it's a wonderful gift that you have by being able to express yourself musically and then being able to bring people up in the world.
I just have to try to not mess it up too badly.
Well, I appreciate that you were just, you were talking about, because you have your one-act opera, and you were having to deal with a nearly 1-year-old who was very sick as you were prepping that performance, and then trying to figure out whether the priority was making that work or helping your daughter become healthy.
Yeah, I mean,
I think you made the right choice.
Yes, and I'm remembering now. I wrote that little blog post, which I in one sense I feel like it had the tone of a cry for help, but it also was just like the extent to which the content of that work was in conversation with what was happening in my life felt worth remarking upon, because the piece ultimately is about family, and this, the entire second half of the piece, which I hope will be in Los Angeles pretty soon. I don't think I'm letting the cat out of the bag to say that it was co-commissioned by the LA Phil. The piece ultimately lands on the sort of importance of community and family, and so the fact that I hadn't memorized the piece because I was taking my kid to urgent care feels really appropriate.
Well, and also that is the same thing every working parent has to deal with, whether they're a secretary or a composer or a garbage collector. It's just that struggle that everybody has.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I have so enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sorry that I have probably about 2 minutes, and then I got to run.
No, I was going to wrap it up anyway, Gabriel. So that's fine with me. I hope at some point, we're seated at a table at another concert, or
I hope so too.
Or having a drink. If I'm sure you'll be here when Lako performs. So
I sadly am missing it because I'm going to be in France.
How awful! You have to be in France.
I'm really, really bummed to be missing it, because I feel like the soul of the piece, the first two movements really feel. The first one feels like it is set in Los Angeles, and the second movement is sort of set between Germany and LA in my mind's eye. And I am actually kind of devastated that I can't be there.
Well, remember what John Lennon wrote: "Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans."
Exactly. Well, thanks again.